It's time to stitch the next two sashing blocks of our hometown quilt. Sashing blocks 3 and 4 will start on page 70, and both of these blocks will only use these two pieces of fabric. As a reminder, I have mine cut to strips, and I'm not sure I mentioned this earlier, but I purchased the yardage of this fabric, and so my strips are cut with the fabric, which just means from selvage to selvage. This green fabric was part of the fat quarter bundle, and so these strips were just cut the width of fabric along the fat quarter, and so these are smaller than these long strips of fabric. So let's get started on sashing 3 and 4. I will be using my 7 by 12 inch hoop, and I do have this second sashing block that I finished last week put into my hoop so that I can save on stabilizer, and so I still have that attached. I will go ahead and bring in 2 more sashing blocks. Now with the 7 by 12, I could get 3 in one hooping without having to move the stabilizer. However, I am just doing 2 sashing blocks at a time, and so I will stitch out the next 2 and then move this up to be ready for the following 2. So let's get started. I will go to embroidery and to my USB, and I will open the sashing folder, and I need to bring in sashing 3. I'm going to hit set and embroidery and go to layout and rotate. I am going to rotate this 90 degrees to the left, and then I am going to move this all the way to the top of the hoop, and that way I can use and save as much stabilizer as I can. Now I will select OK, and I need to bring in the second block, so I will go to return and add, and I'll go back to my USB and to the sashing folder and bring in sashing 4 and hit set and go to edit and rotate, and because that is the last design I brought in, it is automatically selected. I will also rotate that to the left, and again, that was just the right amount of space between the two, and so I am not going to move that. Again, you could bring in a third and move it all the way down to the bottom, but I'm just going to stitch these 2 out, so I will select OK and then embroidery. And I always like to go to the minus plus needle to be on that screen if I need to move forward or back stitches or steps. So I'm going to start with the placement for the batting, and again, as a reminder, I am not doing any kind of color sorting. I will run the first sashing block start to finish before moving to the second. And the thread that I have in is going to be the first thread that is visible as the embroidery, and so it's this brown color, so I've chosen the brown thread that I will use to piece the blocks. All right, so let's get started on the first sashing block. Now for a reminder, all of the sashing blocks will start exactly the same. I'm going to run the placement for the batting. I will place my batting and tack it down. Then I will trim and start piecing the fabric. After stitching the placement line, the first piece of fabric is placed right side up. The second piece would be right side down. And in the first video where I did the first 2 sashing blocks, that is how I placed them. I first placed this fabric along this line and then placed the second piece. However, a faster and easier way is just to line these pieces of fabric up right sides together. I'm just going to line them along those 3 edges and then just place right along that line, making sure it's even. And then it's ready to go. Now I'm going to run the tack down for those 2 pieces of fabric. Once I have the tack down stitched, I will flip over this green fabric and first finger press, and then I am going to take an iron. I don't think that's totally necessary, but I do want to try to get these as flat as possible. And now it's time to run the tack down of these 2 fabrics. Now the directions say to trim around this box, but again, that is not necessary. And you can't get right next to this spot because this tack down and placement of where the seam is comes past that line. And that will all be trimmed off when I cut the block to size. So the only 2 that really need to be trimmed, especially if you have strips like I do, if you have these cut more to size, you don't even have to cut that. But you do want to cut this inside as we need to get ready to place the next piece of fabric. So I will trim that. The next step is a placement line. Again, the next placement line runs right along this, so it's technically really not needed because we can just place the fabric, but I am just going to go ahead and run it, and then we'll place that green piece of fabric, and then finally our last piece. The next piece is the green again. I will center that right over the fabric along that line and run the tack down. And now I will repeat those steps. I will fold that green fabric and finger press. I am going to give it a little bit of an iron. It's going to tack this green piece down, and we'll move on. I'm going to trim just the edge, and then it will run the next tack down for our last piece of fabric. I will place that right side down, flip and fold, trim, and tack down, and then we'll be ready to start the embroidery. Now it's time to start all the great embroidery to finish this first sashing block. This sashing block is just gorgeous. All of the detail in the embroidery I just love, and I haven't seen anything like it. So I am really excited, as I mentioned, to be doing this quilt. So I am going to run the second, which is actually the fourth sashing strip, and it will be using these two fabrics. Everything will be done exactly the same, other than it will have, of course, different embroidery designs and different colors. So let's finish up the fourth sashing block. Now I'm ready to start the embroidery, but I want you to notice that when I place this first piece of pink fabric, it was really close to the stack down line, which is fine because remember the trim line will be just inside that. And so when I went to place my other fabrics, I kind of moved them up. And so I was just really close there and had a lot extra here, but it all works out in the end because this is not the trimming line, it's just the tack down line. All right, let's finish this block with all of the embroidery. I'm done with the first four sashing blocks. This is the last piece of stabilizer that I had left on my roll. It's not quite big enough to fit in my 7x12, so I will just save that for a smaller hoop and start with a fresh piece of stabilizer for the next set of sashings. So I'm going to go ahead and take all three and cut these down to size. Again, the black that I use just helps when I am cutting these to size. I think they look great. I love all the detail in the embroidery. I love them. So what I've done is I will just take the sashing when I get them trimmed to size, and I could put them in order. I might just start stacking. This is 2, 3, and 4. I might just stack them behind one and keep them in order. Of course, it would just be easy to look at the directions to find which block goes where, or I can put them in any order I want. But I think that's what I'm going to do. This will keep them clean and all together. And I've done the same thing with the blocks. I'm keeping them in a packet just so that they stay together, they stay clean, and I don't lose anything. All right, so let me get these trimmed to size. I mentioned in the first sashing block that I trimmed to size that the trim guide is the very last step. And so there shouldn't really be any issue with that being exactly the correct size. If this trimming guide was done prior to all of the stitching, it would probably have shrunk in a little bit, and you'd have to make some adjustments. But because it's the very last step, all of the embroidery has already been done, and so it's always a good thing to check just to make sure. But I have checked all these, and of course, because it was the last step, these are all exactly correct. And so I will just trim right along my black stitching.